In addition to longer music shows, I started to want to do longer radio programs too, like suspense shows. So with almost no technical production capabilities, I found an article in a magazine and gave it a shot.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your host, Jim Fergusson. Welcome again to Awake. Tonight's story, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Adapted for radio by Jim Fergusson. This is another in a series to keep you awake. Ladies and gentlemen, the monsters are due. It was Saturday afternoon on Maple Street, and the late sun retained some of the warmth of a persistent Indian summer. People along the street marveled at winter's delay and took advantage of it. Old Mr. Van Horn, the patriarch of the street, who lived alone, had moved his power saw out on his lawn and was ready to start fashioning new pickets for his fence. It was 4:40 p.m. A football game blared from a portable radio on the front porch, blending with the other sounds of a Saturday afternoon in October. Maple Street, 4:40 p.m. Maple Street, in its last calm and reflective moments before the monsters came. Steve Brand, 40-ish, a big man in an old ex-Marine set of dungarees, was washing his car when the lights flashed across the sky. Everyone on the street looked up at the sound of the whoosh and a brilliant flash that dwarfed the sun. "What was that?" Steve called across at his neighbor, Don Martin, who was fixing a bent spoke on his son's bicycle. Martin, like everyone else, was cupping his hands over his eyes to stare up at the sky.
Looked like a meteor, didn't it? I didn't hear any crash, though.
Nope, nothing except that roar. Steve's wife came to the porch, and then she said,
"Steve, what was that?"
Guess it was a meteor, honey. Came awful close, didn't it?
She went back into the house and became suddenly conscious of something. All along Maple Street, people paused and looked at one another as a gradual awareness took hold. All the sounds had stopped, all of them. There was a silence now. No portable radio, no lawnmowers, no clickety-clack of sprinklers that went round and round on front lawns. There was a complete silence. Mrs. Sharp, 55 years of age, was talking on the telephone, giving a cake recipe to her cousin at the other end of the town, when all of a sudden the circuit clicked off. Old Mr. Van Horn was right in the middle of sawing a 1x4 piece of pine when the power went off. Steve Brand's wife, Agnes, came out on the porch to announce that the oven had stopped working. There was no current or something, and would Steve please look at it? But Steve couldn't look at it at that moment because he was preoccupied with a hose that suddenly refused to give any more water. Across the street, Charlie Farnsworth, fat and dumpy in a loud Hawaiian sports shirt that featured hula girls with pineapple baskets on their heads, barged angrily out toward the road, donning any radio outfit that manufactured a portable with the courtesy to shut off in the middle of a third-quarter forward pass.
Hey, did you see that missile?
Voices built up on top of voices until suddenly there was no more silence. There was a conglomeration of questions and protest, of plain as references to half-cooked dinners, half-watered lawns, half-washed cars, and half-finished telephone conversations. Did it have anything to do with a meteor? That was the main question, the one most asked. Pete Van Horn disgustedly threw aside the cord of his power mower and announced to the group of people who were collected around Steve Brand's station wagon that he was going over to Brennan Avenue to see if the power was off there also. He disappeared into his backyard and was last seen heading into the backyard of the house behind his. Steve Brand, his face wrinkled with perplexity, leaned against his car door and looked around at the neighbors who had collected. Just doesn't make sense. Why should the power go off all of a sudden? And the phone line be dead? Don Martin whipped bicycle grease off his fingers.
Maybe some kind of an electrical storm or something.
Dumpy Charlie's voice was unpleasant and high. Just doesn't seem likely. Sky's just as blue as anything. Not a cloud. No lightning, no thunder, no nothing. How could it be a storm? Mrs. Sharp's face was lined with years, but more deeply by frustrations of earlier widowhood. Well, it's a terrible thing when the phone company can't keep its line open. It's just a terrible thing. What about my portable radio? Ohio State's got the ball on the Southern Methodist 18-yard line. They threw a pass and the darn thing goes off just then. Charlie picked his teeth with a dirty thumbnail. Steve, why don't you go downtown and check with the police? Oh, they'll probably think we're crazy or something. A little power failure and right away everybody gets flustered and everything. Just isn't a power failure. If it was, we'd still be able to get a broadcast on the portable.
Oh, all right. I'll go downtown and we get all this straightened out.
Steve opened the door to his station wagon. He inched his big frame across the front seat behind the wheel and turned on the ignition and pushed the starter. But the car would not start. Doesn't that beat it all? It was working fine before.
Maybe you're out of gas.
No, I just had it filled up. What's it mean? Charlie Farnsworth's piggish little eyes flapped open and shut. It's just as if everything had stopped. Better walk downtown, Steve. Steve got out of the car. They said, it couldn't be a meteor. A meteor couldn't do this. He looked off in thought for a moment, and then he nodded. Come on, let's go. They started to walk away when they heard the boy's voice. Tommy Bishop, age 16, had stepped out in front of the others and was calling to them. Mr. Brand, you better not go. Steve took a step back toward him. Why not? They don't want you to. Steve and Don exchanged a look. Who doesn't want us to? Tommy looked up towards the sky. Them! Them? Who are them? Whoever was up there that came overhead. Steve walked slowly back towards the boy and stopped close to him. What, Tommy? Whoever was in that thing that came over. I don't think they want us to leave here. Steve knelt down in front of the boy. What do you mean, Tommy? What are you talking about? They don't want us to leave. That's why they shut everything off. What makes you say that? Whatever gave you that idea? Mrs. Sharp pushed her way through to the front of the crowd. That's the craziest thing I ever heard. Just about the craziest thing I ever heard. Tommy could feel the unwillingness to believe him. It's always that way. In every story I've ever read about a spaceship landing from outer space. Mrs. Sharp wangled a bony finger in front of Tommy's mother. If you keep talking like that, you better take this boy up to bed. He's been reading too many comic books or seeing too many movies or something. Sally Bishop's face reddened. She gripped Tommy's shoulders tightly. Tommy, she said softly, stop that kind of talk, honey. Steve's eyes never left the boy's face. That's all right. We'll be right back. You'll see. That wasn't a ship or anything like that. It was just sort of a meteor or something. He turned to the group, trying to weight his words with an optimism he didn't quite feel. No doubt it did have something to do with this power failure and the rest of it. Meteors can do strange things like sunspots and things like that.
That's right,
Don said as if picking up a cue.
like sunspots. That's the kind of thing that can raise Cain with radio reception all over the world. And this thing being so close, well, there's no telling what sort of stuff it can do.
He wet his lips nervously.
Come on, Steve, we'll go downtown and see if there isn't what's causing this thing.
Once again, the two men started away. Mr. Bryan! Tommy's voice was defiant and frightened at the same time. He pulled away from his mother and ran after them. Please, Mr. Ryan, please don't leave here! Something about the intense little face made everybody turn and look. Something about the words that carried such emphasis, such belief, such fear. They listened to these three words and rejected them because intellect and logic had no room for spaceships and green-headed things. But the irritation that showed in the eyes and the murmuring and the compressed lips had nothing to do with intellect. A little boy was bringing up fears that shouldn't be brought up, and people on Maple Street this Saturday afternoon were no different from any other set of human beings. Order and reason, logic were slipping away, pushed by the wild conjectures of a 12-year-old boy. Somebody ought to spank that kid! A voice yelled out from the crowd. Tommy Bishop's voice continued defiant. It pierced the murmurings and rose above them. You might not even get to town. It was that way in the story. Nobody could leave. Nobody except